Hi, I'm John Green, and this is Crash Course European History. So we're going to turn our attention today to the Industrial Revolution, one of the most significant developments in human history. Like, imagine with me that it's 1820. I got this idea from the economist Robert Gordon, by the way. You live in, say, England. You probably work in agriculture. When you walk to town, you're either pulling your own cart, or if you're lucky, you have a horse. You have no running water or electricity. When you wash your few items of clothing, you do so by hand. You cook over a fire. You think of time not primarily in minutes and hours, but mostly in relationship to solar cycles, how close it is to night, or to morning, or to midwinter. And in all these respects, your life in 1820 is basically identical to the lives of people in 1720 or 1520, or for that matter, 1220. Now, that's not to say that nothing has changed in those hundreds of years. As we've explored in this series, lots has changed. But as Gregory Clark observed, in terms of standard of living, Europeans in 1800 basically led lives similar to those of Neanderthals. Now imagine that you close your eyes in 1820 and wake up in 1920. By now, most people in England do not work in agriculture. They may work in shops or transportation or mining or workshops or in factories. They measure time in minutes. Cars exist. Some people have radios which transmit information through thin air. A few people even have refrigerators which dramatically decrease food spoilage and the risk of foodborne illness. Occasionally, you might even see an airplane flying in the sky. Oh, and also your country has just emerged from an astonishingly deadly war fought with highly lethal weapons like chlorine gas, weapons that people of 1820 could not possibly have imagined. Welcome to the Industrial Revolution. In this series, we've already talked about revolutions in agriculture that increased European productivity and revolutions in trade that increasingly distributed goods among people in towns and cities instead of having each individual family produce everything it needed. And these forces combined to help create more division of labor, like farmers could focus on farming and textile workers could focus on textile creation, which was more efficient than having each family do every kind of work. So let's begin in the 18th century, when European industrial production is said to have begun. Europe's population was growing after centuries of nonstop wars and plagues and the worst of the Little Ice Age. Meanwhile, products such as coffee and tea and chocolate made with heated water killed bacteria, while products from abroad expanded and varied the pool of nutrients, with corn and potatoes, for instance, generally being more calorie-dense per acre than wheat. In short, lives were getting better and longer, and populations were rising, and this meant that, on average, people had a little more time to learn and tinker and experiment. Many different artisans invented small improvements to existing mechanical devices. Perhaps most famously, John Kay's flying shuttle increased the pace and productivity of weaving. Weavers then needed a greater amount of thread, so tinkerers made that happen by producing inventions such as the spinning jenny, created around 1764 by craftsman James Hargreaves. The spinning jenny was a machine used by individual women working at home, and it allowed a person, using just the power of their hand, to spin not one bobbin of thread, but up to 120 at once. In England, Ellen Hacking and her husband John were among those devising carding machines to straighten cotton and wool fibers for spinning, and at about the same time, Richard Arkwright and his partners invented the water frame, another kind of spinning machine that used water power. And when spinning machines could be linked to a central power source, such as water, many could be placed in a single building. So the world's first factories arose, in part from the pressure to increase production of English cloth for global and domestic markets. Did the center of the world just open? Is one of my polo shirts in there? This cost like $41. Twice a year I go to a polo outlet in southern Indiana and just buy as many of these things as they'll sell to me. And look, I'm not here to advertise polo shirts, but this thing is incredibly comfortable, and also it's like dyed a specific color. Everything about this was completely unimaginable in the early 19th century. In fact, you know what? It's so soft to the touch, I think I'm gonna put it on. Is that weird? Oh yeah, I feel like I'm the bad guy in an 80s movie. How do I look, Stan? Oh, Stan says I look like Steve Bannon. Okay, thus ends that experiment. Back to the show. Let's talk about porcelain. Another tinkerer was the alchemist Johann Friedrich Böttger, who promised the king of Saxony that he could figure out how to make porcelain. Porcelain was such an obsession that wealthy people collected it, and even those with far less would try to buy a piece or two, like a cup or a plate, as we see in many Dutch, French, and other paintings. Two things you see a lot in European paintings of the affluent or those who aspired to affluence: porcelain and pineapples, which were also quite rare and expensive and difficult to produce domestically. Porcelain was also practical because Europeans didn't know other ways to make heat-resistant dishware for their hot drinks. So Böttger was virtually imprisoned until around 1708 when he finally figured out how to make porcelain, although not as beautifully as the Chinese or Japanese did. What we're trying to get at here is that while people love a great story of an inventor and their invention, the Industrial Revolution was the result of lots and lots of people working together, making a series of incremental improvements rather than like geniuses from on high creating amazing things. The real genius of humans is collaboration and also spying. Like, for instance, industrial spies helped with every development in the Industrial Revolution because other regions were far more advanced than Europe in manufacturing, for instance, color-fast dyes, or heat-resistant dishware, or fine weaving and spinning, or even metallurgy. Arkwright, for example, mostly copied designs from imported textiles, and it was those cotton textiles that really caught the imagination of consumers and filled pockets, first of the people who imported textiles from India and China, and then of the daring manufacturers who were successful at copying the lightweight and colorful and washable cotton clothing. But industrial production of cotton was really risky. Like, the rate of business failure during the Industrial Revolution was over 50%, and because of that, experimenting manufacturers worked to keep labor costs as low as they could. One way was to use unpaid orphans from government or religious or charitable institutions as labor. At a time when people didn't know a lot about steam-powered machinery and its dangers, industrial accidents happened all the time, and children were often the victims. Children worked incredibly long hours, and deaths were common. Little Mary Richards was caught up in a machine, and 6- and 7-year-old orphans working alongside her witnessed the, quote, bones of her arms, legs, thighs, etc. successively snap. Her head appeared dashed to pieces, her blood thrown about like water from a twirled mop. Now, I know that's very graphic, but I think it's important to understand the extent of industrial oppression, including the industrial oppression of children. Workers lost arms and eyes and fingers or were otherwise disfigured. Production and profits always came first in an attempt to avoid financial ruin. And industry had other repercussions. It initially increased the demand for slaves even more, for instance. Slaves produced food for workers who had left farms for factories. Slaves also produced tropical crops such as sugar and tobacco and coffee that boosted the energy of many types of workers. And slaves produced the palm and other tropical oils to keep machinery running, as well as the raw materials for industry, especially cotton. It's important to understand that industry thrived due to slave labor and inexpensive child labor, and also through the labor of women who were paid less than men. Over time, more and more people began working in industrialized settings or in economic sectors that supported industry, due in part to the development of the steam engine. In 1776, English inventor James Watt launched a steam engine that improved earlier models. Now, as far back as Roman Egypt and then Ottoman Egypt and China, people had known about steam engines, but Watt's engine was much more efficient, which made it useful in replacing animal and water power, not just in mines, but also powering textile factories and then other machinery. For millennia, almost all human power came from our muscles. Then we harnessed some animal power and eventually some wind and water power. But steam power completely revolutionized how much work could be done on behalf of humans, and also, of course, changed transportation when it was attached to covered and uncovered wagons and ships to make trains and steamships, and eventually automobiles. And the train created, in turn, another kind of demand, because as urbanization soared around railway hubs, small and grand train stations were built along with all the other buildings needed to house the railway's primary and secondary employees. By secondary employees, I mean it wasn't just like station masters and ticket sellers and conductors. There was also a need for shopkeepers and pharmacists and construction workers and teachers and doctors and drivers of coaches, not to mention sanitation workers, police, and urban administrators. Industrialization had a snowball effect, and it wasn't going to be turned back. And all of this meant that everyday life was profoundly transformed. Like, two classes became much more prominent alongside the aristocracy and peasants in the social structure: the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, or working class. The bourgeoisie initially referred to people who lived in towns and cities, or burgs, or bourges. But the term came to refer to those who owned factories or banks or transportation networks, or also large tracts of land for raising livestock and crops. The proletariat comprised the many factory and other workers who lacked tools or land to support themselves, but instead labored for factory owners and others who had the means to produce. In between were the rising professional groups called the middle class in Europe: doctors and lawyers and teachers and others with special skills that serviced society as a whole. We'll see this configuration change over the next couple centuries and watch as tensions unfold among these groups and, at times, boil over. Women also experienced a transformation of everyday life. Like, in the preceding centuries, they had generally worked on farms or in workshops alongside their artisan husbands, or on their own as hat makers and seamstresses and weavers and spinners. During the early days of industrialization, women who had been spinning or weaving at home often switched to factories, and they did many other kinds of work. For example, 18-year-old Anne Egley, with her younger sister, worked 12-hour days in the coal mines, pushing carriages filled with 800 pounds of coal, which was then used to make steam power. She had done this kind of work from the age of 7. I don't know if you know any 7-year-olds, but they should not be working in coal mines. Now, you'll recall that the French and American revolutions, with their emphasis on motherhood and laws stripping women of their property, led to women being discouraged from work. But many continued to do so even when their wages belonged to their husbands. Factories also created, and still create, outwork done by women at home, polishing knives or painting porcelain buttons, for example. But ideology simultaneously shifted to say that women were to be the angels in the household, providing comfort from the various horrors of industrial life, a cultural norm that discouraged women from working outside the home. In the meantime, the classes became aware of their individual identities. The French had outlawed guilds during the Revolution, but industrial and other workers formed their own clubs to protect their interests. They created singing, gymnastic, and sports clubs. This is why early English football teams, for instance, had names like Royal Engineers AFC and Civil Service FC. These groups also often had a lively cafe culture where they discussed politics and read newspapers, often aloud to their comrades because each cafe usually only had one newspaper. Manufacturers and wealthy individuals in cities likewise formed groups based on their common class position. They founded chambers of commerce to protect their financial interests and museums to show off their city's achievements and good taste. Let's go to the thought bubble. Initially, the rise of factories saw those left out of industrial work life, such as artisans and small farmers, protest by breaking machinery or threatening to do so. The swing riots in Britain are one example of what has been called primitive rebellion. Instead of dealing with change by organizing to benefit from and shape the change, so-called primitive rebels went about breaking things. Wreckers of machinery were called Luddites, as they still are today, because menacing notes found alongside sabotage were often signed Ned Ludd. Ludd was an inspirational figure, a weaver who allegedly smashed a textile machine in the 18th century. But gradually, workers inside the factories formed mutual aid societies and eventually unions that negotiated for better terms with owners. And when negotiations failed, they went on strike as a group instead of wrecking the machines with which they earned their living. All in all, industrialization wreaked havoc on people's lives even as it provided many with livelihoods. Towns grew astronomically. Like the textile centre Manchester, England, went from 20,000 people in the 1750s to 400,000 a century later. Conditions in Manchester were abominable, including the development of slums and the spread of disease. They came to lack fresh and safe supplies of water. Garbage and sewage, not to mention animal excrement, filled muddy streets, creating, in the words of one commentator, a universal atmosphere of filth and stink. And conditions in other industrial cities hardly differed. Thanks, Thought Bubble. So, industrialization began in England and the Low Countries, in part thanks to the capital raised by worldwide trade, and because that trade made possible successful imitation of foreign products. But industrialization then spread. It traveled the continent through the 19th century, although it was less dense in Eastern Europe. There, many peasants continued to live hand to mouth. But as we've seen, so did the poor in industrial cities. So was the Industrial Revolution really a revolution? Well, if a revolution is an event full of impact on people's lives, then definitely. But often historians look at revolutions as, like, ending, which the Industrial Revolution really hasn't. Unlike the comparatively brief English Revolution or American Revolution, many see the Industrial Revolution as continuing to make dramatic changes in our way of life today. Today, we expect technologies to change dramatically in our lifetimes. We expect to use different tools to communicate and work than our parents used. But that expectation is only a couple hundred years old. It makes you wonder, if you closed your eyes in 2020 and woke up in 2120, how weird is the world going to be? Oh, thinking about that is stressing me out. Next time, we'll look further at the cultural and political aspects of industrialization. I'll see you then. Thanks for watching. Crash Course is filmed here in the Jaden Smith Studios in Indianapolis. Thanks to Jaden Smith and indeed all of our patrons over at patreon.com/Crash Course. We've got Crash Courses on lots of topics. Please check out others. Thank you again for watching. And as they say in my hometown, don't forget to be awesome.